I once read, I wish I could remember where, an account of a traveler to Moscow in the 1970s. This intrepid traveler didn't know much Russian, but he had a map and he had some places he wanted to see, and he figured he could find his way around. But he got hopelessly lost and confused. The street names on his map matched, he thought, the street corner he was on, but this corner had a huge ornate church at one corner, whereas his map clearly showed that corner as occupied by a government office. He circled the block and crossed the street several times trying to figure out where he was. And finally, he was approached by a policeman who thought his behavior was suspicious and asked to see his papers. The author explained in his nearly non-existent Russian that he was lost. The policeman took his map and pointed to the corner in question. "But," said the author, pointing to the church, "this corner has a church, not an office building." The policeman straightened up and said firmly and flatly, pointing to the church, "That is an office building. You are here." And in a frightened sort of way, as if he had been caught in a compromising situation, the officer turned and hurried away. The author caught on immediately. This was Russia in its aggressively secular state period. There was no such thing as a church in Russia. No doubt there were offices in that grand old building, which looked so much like a church, and which had kept him from seeing what was really there. Once he understood the real relationship between the map and the territory, he had no more difficulty finding his way around. There is nothing as confusing as an inaccurate map. And maps come in all kinds in our world. The kinds that show streets, of course, but also the kinds of mental maps that we have that give us the lay of the land, so to speak. Mental maps include truisms and folk wisdom and all the things that everybody just knows, and which they repeat without thinking. Mental maps like that help us to make fast decisions. They relieve us from having to puzzle out everything for ourselves. But when they're inaccurate, they can cause us big problems. So when some piece of knowledge becomes a truism, something that everybody knows, I get interested. Is it true? Does it make sense? Is it helpful? And a few years ago, I got interested in the religion causes violence truism. I wondered if it was true. I wondered if it was helpful. In the reading, you heard a perfect example of this sentiment that religion is prone to violence, stated by a religious person, a professor of religion, as a matter of fact. It is somewhat trite, but nonetheless sadly true, to say that more wars have been waged, more people killed, and so on and so forth. He does not support these claims, by the way. How very unacademic of him. As a matter of fact, it is simply not true that more people have been killed in the name of religion than in any other cause. Communism, with its staggering death tolls, 100 million people killed in Russia alone, for starters, probably has that distinction. Nor are most wars fought for religious reasons. Even what we call sectarian violence, those dreary, long-lasting conflicts between two groups of people, often have racial, tribal, and especially economic causes that are really more important than the religious ones. These are things that academics in religion ought to know. It's a tribute to the power of this particular mental map that we currently have in this culture that a respected scholar fell into this trap. Here's another version of the same mental map. A quote by Nobel Prize-winning physicist Steven Weinberg, who is an atheist. "With or without religion," he says, "you'd have good people doing good things and evil people doing evil things. But for good people to do evil things, that takes religion. Now we could spend the rest of the morning thinking up examples of good people doing evil things without the benefit of religion. Consider the vaccine deniers. The evil they're doing is on every front page these days. But I know a few, I bet you do too. And they are good people on every other measure that I can take. Some tried to claim a religious reason to get an exemption, but those were so easily seen through that the media has quit reporting it. You could say the same of most Israelis and Palestinians, most of the fighters in Northern Ireland, most of the Buddhists and Hindus fighting and resisting in Myanmar. These are struggles for land, for power, for existence. They are made worse by the fact that the two different religions are involved, but they are not caused by that difference. In U.S. history, the fact that Native Americans were not Christians made it a bit easier for whites to appropriate their land. But if you think that their being Christians would have stopped that steal, consider the fact that most African American slaves were Christians, and that didn't end slavery. It is true that some people do violence because of their religious beliefs. It's also true that religion provides plenty of ideological nooks and crannies which people otherwise prone to violence can latch onto and exploit. That's not quite what people who say religion causes violence mean. What they mean is that religion is uniquely or especially prone to violence, more prone to violence than other kinds of human institutions and belief systems, such as nations, economic systems, and desires such as greed and lust for power. Sometimes they also mean that religion's propensity to violence is unredeemed by any of its other qualities, unlike the violence of other institutions and belief systems, which, according to this particular map, are at least useful and rational about their violence. So let's just take apart that statement, religion causes violence, and ask ourselves, what is religion and what is violence? And see if it can be said with any truth or logic that religion causes violence in any disproportionate measure. So what is religion? Well, we know it when we see it, we think. That might be another dangerous little map we have, though, because as a matter of fact, religion is not all that easy to define. Let's give it a try. Let's see. A system of belief in God or gods. Oops. That would eliminate Confucianism and many forms of Buddhism. We know those are religions. Let's see. How about a system of beliefs based on sacred texts? Whoops. That would eliminate Unitarian Universalists. Okay, take out the texts. How about a system of beliefs that connects an individual to a larger reality, abstract or otherworldly, and requires or recommends certain ritual activities to make that connection real? Lots of religions don't put stock in beliefs, but every religion has recommended actions to connect a person to a reality larger than they are. But oops, that definition would mean that the sports fan whose connection to his team does indeed connect him to a larger reality than himself and leads him to watch lots of games and wear clothing in unusual color combinations would mean that he was practicing a religion. More troubling, it suggests that people whose love of nation connects them to an identity and a set of values larger than theirs, who salutes the flag and gets all teary when they hear the Star-Spangled Banner, is being religious. There are schools of religious thought that study such things as patriotism and celebrity worship and sports mania as religious phenomenon. But defining religion that broadly is not very helpful when you're trying to prove that religion is a uniquely dangerous cause of violence. And yet, if you define religiousness very narrowly, it isn't going to include all the phenomena that we all know are religious, like Unitarian Universalism. This lack of a good definition can trip people up. Consider the case of Martin Marty, who was a preeminent historian of religion in this nation, one of the true giants of 20th century religious life here, a man due all honor and respect. But in one of his many books, he talked about the situation of the Jehovah's Witnesses in the U.S. in the 1940s. Jehovah's Witnesses, you may remember, believe that saluting the flag is a form of idolatry, so they don't do it. In the 1940s, in this nation, this fact enraged some people to the point where there were incidents of beatings, lynchings, tar and feathering, even castration, and imprisonment also by official sources of Jehovah's Witnesses by citizens of the United States. Marty regrets this, but his comment is, religion can cause all kinds of trouble in the public arena. There's that map again. But wait a minute here. The violence to Jehovah's Witnesses was not done by religious people who were defending their religion. It was done to religious people by people who were defending their nation, its rituals, and its meaning. If you're defining religion so broadly as to include nationalism, that would be one thing. That would make the religion causes violence equation truer. But it's hardly fair to blame the Jehovah's Witnesses' religion for the violent response of their patriotic neighbors. So what's violence? The truth of the statement, religion causes violence, is made quite fuzzy by the fact that it's difficult even for professionals to define religion, not to mention to separate religious motivations from the many other motivations by which humans live and move. So then there's that interesting word, violence. What's violence? Well, violence is harm to persons. Well, we don't usually call it violence when a pedestrian is simply hit by a car. That can be violent, the adverb, but not violence, the noun. A pedestrian hit by a car is only called violence if it's done on purpose. So violence is intentional harm to a person, and perhaps intentional harm to a person or their property, but not to property in general. If it's my building and I blow it up, nobody calls that violence. If I blow up somebody else's building on purpose because I want to hurt them, that might be called violence. But what if I'm a soldier and the building is enemy headquarters? Is that violence? Some people would say, no, that's not violence. That's force, legitimate force in their minds. At least in the soldier's mind, it's legitimate force. It's important to notice this way the word violence is used, because it means that the word violence has overtones of illegitimacy. And that adds to the real problem with the religion causes violence map, which is not that religious people get lots of blame for the bad things that happen in our world, at least not only that. Another problem is that our map keeps us from seeing what actually does cause the bad things in our world. Community organizers have a motto, follow the money. They mean by this that when something seems inexplicable or crazy or weird, and that happens in a community, or when good government is not happening in a community, you follow the money. You figure out who's benefiting from this thing you don't understand, and then you often find that you do understand it. To extend that way of inquiring into puzzling phenomenon, what are the benefits of proclaiming to all that religion promotes violence? Well, there's some psychological bennies to atheists, of course, who enjoyed their witty, best-selling books lambasting religion and proclaiming how dangerous it was in the early part of this century. But they didn't invent that map. They only capitalized on it. No, the biggest beneficiaries are those who don't want us to notice or abhor the massive violence done in the name of secular institutions, like nations, ideologies, economics, power struggles, greed, and the like. And that's where this map in our heads is not only inaccurate, but puzzling and dangerous. In keeping us focused on the dangers of the church on the corner, it neglects to warn us of the dangers of the traffic in the streets or the thugs in the doorways. There's a sense in which the religion causes violence argument is saying that kind of violence is pointless, stupid, damaging, and illegitimate. And if we stop there, we're actually implicitly saying, and other kinds of violence are okay. Those kinds of violence, the kinds we do in the name of our property, our honor, our nation, our economic system, that kind of violence is necessary, rational, and proper, if regrettable. It's really idiotic to kill young men to propitiate the gods. But when we send young men to die in a secular war, is that okay? How the Inquisition declared women to be evil witches and killed them en masse in some places, leaving no woman behind in an entire village. How infuriatingly criminal, how irrationally just like religion, we say. But how the American government drove Native Americans off their land in order to make way for civilization in the past. How the Myanmar junta is doing the same thing in their nation today. We may feel sad, helpless, angry, but not enough to do something about it, probably. Not even enough to say furiously, how just like a government. The equation of religion with violence goes way too far in legitimizing other kinds of violence and blinding us to that. Secondly, and at this moment perhaps most dangerously, the equation of religion, especially other people's religion, with violence, allows us to maintain an arrogant separation between the Western world, we who believe that we have separated church and state and therefore run our affairs in a rational, predictable way, and places and people such as Muslims who don't so separate that. It allows us to simply feel superior and more involved, rather than attempting to understand or adapt. This infuriates them and is a cause of tension in our world. Even worse, our equation of our scheme of separation of church and state with evolved and rational and nonviolent can lead us to think that we're doing others a favor to bring them the blessings of rationalism and democracy and separation of church and state, even if we have to use force to do so. It's time to ditch the map that says that religion is somehow more prone to violence than any other human institution. Of course, violence is sometimes done because of, or in the name of, or with the help of religion. And violence is sometimes done because of, or with the help of, sometimes in the name of, hunger for power, need for resources, pride, materialism, nationalism, celebrity worship, sports partisanship even, political ideology, or fear. Because the fact of the matter is that we humans have violence in us, even we good ones. And we must, if we are to do good and avoid evil, find ways to temper our response to all the isms which beset us. And that's mostly done with love and justice. And the fear and the greed, which are also part of who we are, that's mostly done by our quest for wisdom and true joy in our lives. And so, irony of irony, we're back to religion now, and what it all teaches at its heart, which is that love is at the deep heart of the world, and that calls us to love our neighbors and to learn to understand them. That justice should roll down like waters, and that we should be a part of that great flow. That in the end, we need never be afraid, that there is always possibility for us of great joy, and that the wise follow these paths.